violence. And I really remember it because I grew up in a household where we talked a lot about social issues and politics, and generally everybody was on the same page, whether we were talking about a woman's right to choose or affirmative action or whatever it was. The hearings was one of the first moments where I remember them having a different point of view. You know, my dad was very pulled compassionately toward this African American man who was having his career and his reputation destroyed by this panel of older white men and being attacked by a woman. And my mom was really pulled in the direction of this African American professional woman who was coming forward and being re-victimized.
You know, it's very clear from the beginning that Anita Hill, who's seen leading a quiet, single life, teaching law at the University of Oklahoma, that she was not interested in revealing this decade-old secret about what she said happened to her in the company of Clarence Thomas. And at some point, an aide from the Senate Judiciary Committee calls her up to inquire about his background. Let's listen to just a bit of that phone conversation.
Professor, we've heard that Judge Thomas mistreated young women who worked for him at the EEOC. Do you know anything about that?
That's not something I can talk about.
Why not?
I'll put it this way. If I were advising someone who were a victim of his unwanted advances, I don't think I would suggest that she come forward.
In my experience, in a case like this,
when someone comes forward, the victim tends to become the villain. I've never listened to just the audio of that scene. I was thinking in 5 seasons of Scandal, I've never been allowed to speak that slowly. We speak very quickly on this show. I think I was really drawn to the idea of, you know, I have spent 5 seasons now playing somebody who, for the most part, is always the most powerful person in the room in Washington, D.C., and who wields extraordinary access and power. And I think I wanted to explore the idea of being someone in that very same environment who's at the opposite end of the spectrum and who has to figure out how to hold her own in those spaces without having that power.
She's quite physically upright in her bearing and careful with what she says, which I think in real life and also in this movie made it all the more shocking when she speaks during the hearings, when she testifies to what she says was the explicit language that Clarence Thomas used in describing his sexual interest to her. Now, of course, I have to say, Clarence Thomas, of course, denies all of this.
Of course, you know, of course.
And did then.
One of my priorities and part of my passion was making sure that we told a complicated 3-dimensional story where you did feel for all of these characters. Because I grew up in a household where people that I loved really were able to step into the shoes of more than one of these characters at a time when none of us knew. I mean, we use the term sexual harassment now so freely and fluidly, but back then that was a vague legal term that people were not using. There was very little public understanding about even what sexual harassment was.
I will say, though, that this Judiciary Committee has, in fact, gone down in history as not having done a very good job. But also when you see them, all men, all white, they seemed to feel free to sit in judgment of her. I mean, leave her just hanging out there.
Well, and to be honest with you, both of them. I mean, when you ask African Americans how they felt about it at the time, a lot of people felt uncomfortable about the fact that these older white men were sitting in judgment of him as well. There was a sense that this representational body didn't represent us as a country. There were no women up there. There were no younger representatives. There were no people of color. I think it was a real moment of reckoning for this country. It's why the following year was the Year of the Woman, where more women ran than ever before. The Senate Judiciary Committee had its first woman in the year following the hearings. The shape and the face of our congressional body started to change because people became more aware.
You know, in the end, of course, and we know the ending, Clarence Thomas is now a Supreme Court justice. He was approved. There's a scene in the film that contains words of his that have become famous. It's a moment where he unfurls very openly and powerfully the question of race and what it means to be a black man in America.
This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. And from my standpoint, as a black American, as far as I'm concerned, it's a high-tech lynching. uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves, do for themselves, to have different ideas. It is a message that, unless you kowtow to the old order, this is what will happen to you.
Oh, it's so powerful.
I mean, that was real. That was right, exactly what
It's
happened.
verbatim. Everything that happens in the hearings in the film is verbatim, which is shocking to some people because they think, no, you must have embellished that stuff. Nope,
It's like game over.
it is. And again, in my memories of my parents talking about the hearing, I remember them quoting that line, the high-tech lynching. And I remember that struggle of the women in the room. It was my mom and my dad and a couple of the professors that they were friends with saying, that's not, the women saying, that's not what this is about. And the men saying, well, isn't it? It's really the moment when he shifts the conversation, because there isn't a single senator who's willing to challenge him when he claims being a victim of racism in that moment. It's so complicated. It's what I love about exploring the hearings.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Kerry Washington.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me.
Kerry Washington stars as Anita Hill in the new HBO movie, Confirmation.
You're listening to Morning Edition on WNYC at 7:30. Today on the Leonard Lopate Show, actors Saoirse Ronan, Bill Camp, and Sophie Okonedo talk about their new Broadway production of Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Plus, on this week's Please Explain, NPR's Nina Totenberg joins Jeffrey Toobin from The New Yorker to review the history of the Supreme Court and whether or not it's ever been politically neutral. It's coming up today at noon here on WNYC.
WNYC support comes from St. Martin's Press, publisher of Lust and Wonder, a new memoir from Augustine Burroughs that examines what it means to be in love and figuring out all that comes along with it. The New York Community Trust, helping generous New Yorkers fund the causes they love in their communities. What do you love? More at nycommunitytrust.org.
Just ahead, we've known for some time about a chemical linked to lung disease among workers at a microwave popcorn factory. Now that chemical may also be putting coffee workers at risk. Alarms first sounded in a couple of roasting factories in Wisconsin. We've got the details coming up in about 15 minutes. This is WNYC at 7:31. Here's Soundcheck's John Schaefer with today's Gig Alert.
He's known as the Mozart of Madras, and also called the Musical Storm in India. He's producer and songwriter A.R. Rahman, and he is one of the world's best-selling recording artists, thanks largely to his prolific work as a composer for Bollywood, as South Asia's huge film industry is known. You've heard his music here in the States in Slumdog Millionaire and The 100-Foot Journey, but that's just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Tonight, celebrate the music of A.R. Rahman with the electric guitarist Prasanna, one of his longtime collaborators. It's at the Rubin Museum of Art, and you can learn more at soundcheck.org.
It's going to be another beautiful day today. Sunny skies, getting up into the lower 60s. Then tonight dips down to a clear 42. Weekend's looking very pleasant as well. Sunny skies both days, getting up to the mid-60s tomorrow and then up to around 70 on Sunday. Right now it is clear in New York City, 44 degrees in Central Park. It's 35 in White Plains, 34 in Bridgewater at 7:33.
Support for NPR comes from WNYC members and from the Wallace Foundation, a source of ideas for improving education and enrichment for children, both in and out of school. More information is available at wallacefoundation.org. And Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, working to explore the next generation of targeted therapies for many cancers. Videos, white papers, and patient stories are available at discovercarebelieve.org.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. Good morning. I'm Renee Montagne.
And I'm David Green. Not exactly friendly last night on the Democratic debate stage. 5 days away from a pretty important primary in New York State, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were arguing about each other's qualifications and also their positions on guns, Wall Street, the 1994 crime bill, also Israel. Here's NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson.
The CNN debate at the Brooklyn Navy Yard was aggressive, sarcastic, and at times downright nasty. Clinton and Sanders didn't hide their exasperation with each other as they continued their week-long fight over who is qualified to be president. Sanders barely couched his charge that Clinton wasn't.
Does Secretary Clinton have the experience and the intelligence to be a president? Of course she does. But I do question her judgment. I question a judgment which voted for the war in Iraq, the worst foreign policy blunder in the history of this country.
Clinton was ready with a ferocious attack of her own, asking voters to read Senator Sanders' interview with the New York Daily News.
When asked about a number of foreign policy issues, he could not answer about Afghanistan, about Israel, about counterterrorism, except to say if he'd had some paper in front of him, maybe he could.
Clinton defended herself aggressively as Sanders attacked her again for accepting donations from Wall Street.
I stood up against the behaviors of the banks when I was a senator. I called them out on their mortgage behavior.
Sanders responded with unconcealed disgust.
Secretary Clinton called them out. Oh my goodness, they must have been really crushed by this. And was that before or after you received huge sums of money by giving speaking engagements behind them? So they must have been very, very upset by what you did.
Clinton was asked again why she wouldn't release the transcripts of her paid speeches to investment banks. She said she'd do it when other candidates did the same, and she called on Sanders to release his tax returns, which he said he would do starting today. Sanders and Clinton also clashed over guns. Sanders chuckled as Clinton once again attacked him for voting with the NRA on several bills.
This is a serious difference between us, and what I want to start by saying, it's not a laughing matter. 90 people on average a day are killed or commit suicide or die in accidents from guns. 33,000 people a year.
The 1994 crime bill signed by President Bill Clinton has become a flashpoint in the race. Last night, Hillary Clinton came close to apologizing for her support of the bill, which many black voters believe has devastated their communities.
Do you regret your advocacy for the crime bill?
Well, look, I supported the crime bill. My husband has apologized. He was the president who actually signed it. Senator Sanders voted for it. I'm sorry for the consequences that were unintended and that have had a very unfortunate impact on people's lives.
One of the biggest substantive differences was on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Sanders didn't budge on his view that Israel's response to Palestinian violence was disproportionate, even though that position is unpopular among New York voters.
Long term, there will never be peace in that region unless the United States plays a role, an even-handed role, trying to bring people together and recognizing the serious problems that exist among the Palestinian people. That is what I believe the world wants us to do, and that's the kind of leadership that we have got to exercise.
Well, if I want to add, again, describing the problem is a lot easier than trying to solve it.
That was Clinton's mantra throughout the debate as she compared her practical experience to his idealistic goals. Sanders now needs to win the remaining primaries by big margins in order to cut into Clinton's lead in pledged delegates. The New York primary on Tuesday is one of his last best chances to do that. Mara Liasson, NPR News.
The fallout continues over what's come to be known as North Carolina's bathroom law. That new state law blocks local governments in North Carolina from passing their own non-discrimination laws.
Laws that would include expanding LGBT protections, like allowing transgender people to choose between men's and women's bathrooms.
Some state lawmakers there are having second thoughts about the bill, including our next guest. Representative Larry Bell points out that a special session was called to consider the bill, and the vote came too quickly for him to read much more than the parts he thought would appeal to his conservative rural constituents. Then, this former superintendent of schools got a call from a student he once coached.
The student was one of my smartest students that I have ever taught. And he was telling me that he was a part of the LGBT community. He asked me, did I know that? And I told him, no, I didn't. That kind of opened my eyes that people were looking at us and thinking that we were hate mongers or something like that because we voted for that bill.
Which also quickly gave rise to calls to boycott the state. This outcry, I mean, are people, do you think there in North Carolina, concerned about the loss of business, the loss of travelers, the loss of...
We're just kind of recovering from the recession, and I think it's a real bad time for us to be losing jobs, and I think everybody will have a concern about that. This is not an issue that we need to be dealing with. We are a state that in the past, I think we've taken the lead. When I was in college, we started sit-in demonstrations. Discrimination is not in my blood. And I just feel like that's the way a lot of people feel, and they would probably be willing to try to pick North Carolina out of that.
Do you think that repealing this law is a realistic possibility?
I think with the outcry, that is a possibility. I think a lot of people, since they were rushed into it, would probably reconsider and probably say we don't need the bill at all. I mean, which is my position. I don't think we needed it at all.
So if a trans woman wanted to use a public restroom designated as a women's restroom, you would not have a problem with that?
No, I would assume that if it's a trans woman, they would look like a woman and probably wouldn't be any problem. Just like now, nobody asking a question.
Well, just to clarify, if this law came up to be repealed, would you vote to repeal this law?
I would, yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and talking about this.
Okay, thank you.
Larry Bell is a Democratic state representative in North Carolina.
You're listening to Morning Edition on WNYC. Wall Street has come under fire from several of the presidential candidates, and now they're here campaigning and fundraising before Tuesday's primaries. How the financial industry is responding to the presidential campaigns coming up in about 10 minutes. It's going to be another nice day today. Sunny skies, getting up into the lower 60s. Right now, though, it's clear, 44 degrees, a little chilly at 7:41.
WNYC receives support from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, dedicated to promoting informed and engaged communities, and committed to helping public radio advance journalism excellence in the digital age. More at knightfoundation.org. WNYC is a media partner for Penn World Voices Festival. Historian Rafael Rojas, director Juan Carlos Camacho Malberti, and more debate Today's Cuba, April 29th. Details at pennworldvoices.org.
WNYC is the station that brings NPR News to New York City.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Dave Mattingly. Defense Secretary Ash Carter boarded the USS John C. Stennis aircraft carrier today in the South China Sea. Carter's visit follows joint U.S. and Philippine military exercises involving that carrier. Simone Orendine has more from Manila.
Secretary Carter is emphasizing the U.S. alliance with the region. He says the Stennis has been around here 6 times in the past several years, and that each trip to the disputed waters adds a stitch to the region's security network. China, which claims just about the whole South China Sea, will likely say this goes against peace and cooperation.
Carter was in Manila yesterday announcing plans to strengthen military ties between the U.S. and the Philippines, including joint patrols in the South China Sea. Amazon says it's converting one of its unused buildings in downtown Seattle into a temporary homeless shelter. Ashley Gross with member station KPLU says the company is responding to the city declaring an emergency over its growing homeless population.
Amazon has a building sitting empty until it begins construction on it next year. So the company offered to team up with a local nonprofit and convert it into a shelter. The place will house about 200 people. A recent one-night homeless count found almost 3,000 people without shelter in Seattle.
I'm Dave Mattingly, NPR News in Washington.
And this is WNYC in New York at 7:44. Good morning. I'm Satirius Johnson. The councilman representing the Brooklyn neighborhood of East New York has come out in favor of a controversial rezoning plan. Rafael Espinal says he negotiated changes that'll require developers to build more affordable apartments in the neighborhood. He says the administration has also agreed to boost its investment in local infrastructure and increase support for homeowners.
I fought for a better plan, and I am proud that we are voting on today is vastly better than the one sent to us by the City Planning Commission months ago.
But community activists say the new housing still won't be affordable to East New York's poorest residents. Nearly half the households make less than $30,000 a year. The city says it'll use subsidies to make sure apartments are affordable to those residents as well. In Rockland County, a town supervisor and the former head of a development corporation have been charged with securities fraud. U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara says the two men repeatedly lied about finances in the town of Ramapo, and he says they secretly funded construction of a minor league baseball stadium that the public had rejected. Bharara says Ramapo is one of the state's most fiscally distressed towns and that it's had to take on more debt, raise taxes, and operate a money-losing stadium. And the New York Post is endorsing Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump. In an editorial this morning, the paper calls Trump a rookie candidate, but says he has, quote, electrified the public. The Post says if he wins the nomination, they expect he will pivot not just on the issues, but in his manner as well. So it'll be sunny today, getting up into the lower 60s. Right now, we have clear skies over the city, 44 degrees in Central Park, 35 in New Brunswick at 7:45.
On the next Brian Lehrer Show.
The crisis of affordable housing.
From the bottom on up.
It's your reactions to the Brooklyn debate, listeners. Debate questioner Era Lewis and other guests take your calls. And former Congressman Barney Frank defends the Dodd-Frank bank reform law as too good to fail. The Brian Lehrer Show, weekdays at 10 a.m. on WNYC.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Renee Montaigne.
And I'm David Green. We've known for a while about this chemical that caused lung disease in workers at a microwave popcorn factory. Well, now it looks like that same chemical could affect the coffee world. Not people at home grinding or brewing up a pot, but people who make a living in roasting and packaging coffee. Susan Benz from member station WUWM reports.
Step into Mike Moon's Madison, Wisconsin coffee roasting world, and the aroma of beans from Brazil to Laos immediately washes over you. Moon says he aims to run an efficient and very safe plant. That starts the minute beans spill out of the roaster.
Now the cooling can is designed so that it draws air from the room in over the beans and exhausts that air out of the facility. So it's really grabbing a lot of all of the gases that are coming off of the coffee.
So why are these gases so worrisome? Because of diacetyl, a natural byproduct of the coffee roasting process. Diacetyl is used commercially and is added to foods like microwave popcorn to help with the flavor. But exposure to diacetyl can be hard on the lungs, as Rachel Bailey observed 4 years ago at a coffee roasting business in Texas. She is with the CDC's National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH.
Physicians at a nearby University Medical Center had diagnosed 5 former workers with a very severe lung disease called obliterative bronchiolitis. So we visited this facility.
What they found was diacetyl.
We found the highest concentrations in the flavoring room and then in the grinding packaging room.
As researchers still try to figure out how much exposure is too much, Bailey worries about the potential exposure of thousands of people nationwide involved in the coffee business, from roasting to packaging. But in Madison, Wisconsin, Mike Moon says he knew nothing about the chemical. But that changed when a reporter at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel asked Moon to allow an industrial hygienist to check for the presence of diacetyl. The results raised concerns, and Moon immediately asked NIOSH to dig deeper. He's waiting for a final report. For now, Moon is following NIOSH's advice.
We're circulating air in the facility more. We're exhausting air, being more deliberate about that, and bringing in fresh air.
NIOSH is juggling a dozen requests from roasters around the country. None report diacetyl-related health problems by its employees. Meanwhile, the National Coffee Association's Joe DeRupa says his group is carrying out its own analysis.
We are looking further because current science does not indicate any support for the premise that exposure to diacetyl alone, that's created naturally in the roasting and grinding of unflavored coffee, increases the risk of obstructive lung disease.
In Milwaukee, coffee roaster Lincoln Fowler established some best practices that appear to be working. He spent years perfecting his shop's airflow system and recently called in experts to test it. The diacetyl count there came in well below NIOSH's proposed standards. Fowler thinks concerns about workplace well-being should be put in perspective.
Our 154-pound bags of coffee, I'm constantly after our staff to be careful how you lift, and I would argue that potential back problems are probably a much more significant threat.
People eager for official guidance on safe diacetyl levels will have to wait. Although NIOSH developed recommendations for safe exposure, rules are not yet established. For NPR News, I'm Susan Bentz in Milwaukee.
You're not going to want to miss All Things Considered later today because your childhood dreams are going to come true. The Jungle Book is coming to life in a new movie.
You're listening to Morning Edition on WNYC. Stay tuned now for WNYC's Money Talking. It's just ahead. And later on the program, 4 decades ago, many Democrats in Pennsylvania's Fayette County crossed over and voted for Ronald Reagan, as did many others across the nation. And the chairman of the Democratic Party in Fayette County says he's seeing a similar crossover again, this time with GOP presidential candidate Donald Trump. And Brazil's president faces a massive political crisis over alleged corruption, but while polls show most voters in favor of impeaching Dilma Rousseff, it's not just because of the scandal. For many, it's because of the economy. And the campaign to persuade British voters to choose to stay in the European Union was once comfortably ahead, but ahead of the referendum, polls now show voters are evenly split. Weather continues for the next several days. We've got sunny skies in store for us today, all the way through at least Tuesday. It's going to be highs for us in the lower 60s today. Then tonight it remains clear with lows near 42. Tomorrow we'll be getting up into the mid-60s, and then around 70 will be the high for Sunday. It looks like Monday we'll get up to about 75. Right now it is clear in New York City, 44 degrees in Central Park. It is 35 in White Plains, 35 in Morristown as well. This is WNYC at 7:51.
Support for NPR comes from member stations and from American Jewish World Service, working for 30 years to end poverty and advance human rights worldwide. Learn more at ajws.org. And the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, working with others to build a culture of health, enabling all in America's diverse society to lead healthier lives, now and for generations to come. On the web at rwjf.org.
From WNYC, this is Money Talking. I'm Charlie Herman.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, it is so great to be in New York.
First of all, it's great to be home. This is home. It's great to be home. We love New York.
But I am very proud that I was born here in New York City.
Usually by this point in the presidential nominating process, the two parties have already settled on their candidates. Now, for the first time in years, New York is playing a significant role. It's just one of the many examples of how this year's race has not turned out quite like many people would have thought. And many of those people live right here in New York City. Wall Street traders, bankers, lawyers, people with money, and usually influence. They have bet big on Clinton, but Sanders is still in the race. And their picks for the Republican ticket, Bush, Christie, Rubio, Walker. Remember Walker? Well, joining me are Rob Cox with Reuters Breaking Views and Ben White with Politico. And Ben, at this point in the campaign, who are the deep-pocketed New Yorkers lining up for?
Well, some of them, as you mentioned, are lining up for Hillary Clinton. On the Republican side, it's basically anybody but Trump. And the problem for Republicans on Wall Street is that person right now is Ted Cruz. He's the next in line after Trump for the Republican nomination. And he's been out there sounding a lot like Bernie Sanders, beating up on the big banks, calling them too big to fail, playing the populist card. So I think, if Cruz were to get the nomination, you'd see a fair amount of Wall Street money move his way. But
big bulk of it, even some that are right in the middle, would go to Hillary Clinton as the safer choice for the banking industry.
Rob, is the money being spent in other ways? Are they trying to influence this election either through particular initiatives or even how the convention itself will play out?
Well, I think one of the really amazing things about this election is the fact that the people